comedians, they must make themselves laugh, and so as a writer of horror and crime fiction, you have to scare yourself.
How many people can you name who have played top division football, had a #1 album, and written multiple best-selling novels? Well, here's one now, Jo Nesbø, who is here to talk about his new book, The Nigh House, which was published on Thursday. Jo Nesbø, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you.
The Nigh House is a standalone novel, not part of the Harry Hole. Am I saying that right? Harry Hole?
Yeah, well, it's pretty close to Norwegian. When I go abroad, I basically just say Harry Hole.
Harry Hole. Harry Hole. I'm going to go with Hole.
Yeah.
Look, the new book, The Nigh House, it's not part of the Harry Hole canon or one of your other series that you've done. Tell me about the book itself and why you chose to write a standalone like this.
This is a horror story. It's probably in the style of Stephen King and Stranger Things, and but it's based on the kind of stories I told when I was a kid. I was the youngest kid, but the older kids, they always wanted me to tell the ghost stories because, and I thought for many years it was because I was the best storyteller, but years later they told me it was because they could hear the fear in my voice when I told the stories. So they really liked that effect. Yourself. I was definitely. I think that is my fuel for horror story is my own fears from when I was young.
That's fascinating for a writer, though, because if you can frighten yourself, then presumably you can excite yourself. You can make yourself passionate to find out with a crime novel how it's going to turn out. You're writing as though you're a reader.
Yeah, I think comedians, they must make themselves laugh, and so as a writer of horror and crime fiction, you have to scare yourself.
Yeah, sure. So look, the publicity, and you mentioned as well that it's sort of in the tradition of Stephen King, Stranger Things. That idea of horror through the eyes of kids, of teenage kids. What's the appeal there? What's the magic there? Because there is one.
Yeah, it's kind of. I tried to figure out why is it that in horror stories there's almost always teenagers. There's especially maybe an American tradition of that. Of course, if they're even younger, children as victims, that's probably more disturbing than adults getting eaten or killed or tortured. But the thing with teenagers, I do think there's something about the innocence and the capacity of being scared that are bigger among teenagers. And especially for me, looking back, I was more scared as a teenager than I can be now. Of course, in American horror movies, the tradition is that if you're a teenager and you've had sex before being married,
then you're going to die.
Then you're going to die.
Yeah.
So keep your virginity and maybe you will survive. That is sort of the message.
Is there something about the, you said the innocence, but something about the kind of the openness that teenagers have that they haven't sort of shut down in the way that we do as we grow older?
Yeah, and it's also about, the problems you're facing as a teenager. That seems like, really big problems at the time, social problems, getting friends, falling in love, being accepted, being rejected. And then comes along a bigger problem, death.
Yeah. And look, the idea of your many of your crime books they're obviously horrifying, but there's a slight difference when you're talking about something that's more directly looking at horror. Is it something you've always sort of been drawn by?
I've always been drawn by the kind of horror story in the Nigh House, but the detective story, the whodunit story. I wasn't really that much into that. I was a reader when I was young, but it was the first crime writer that really caught my attention was Jim Thompson, who wrote in the 50s and 60s. He wrote in the tradition of the hard-boiled American detective, and his books, The Killer Inside Me and Population 1280, they were like American Psycho, written 30 years before Bret Easton Ellis did so, and it was just dark and brutal and beautiful.
Yeah, all together. Look, you obviously often return to your characters in your books. You know, particularly, I mean, Harry Hole particularly. When you write a one-off book, do you do that to get away from the character, or do you do that in a manner that makes you think maybe this won't just be a one-off book?
No, it's more based on ideas. When I became a writer, one of the reasons why I stopped working, have a normal job, was I didn't want a boss, but I have a new boss, and that's the story. That's the idea, and so I don't really have a strategy or anything when deciding which book to write next. It's all about you wake up in the morning and you have this great idea and you want to pursue that idea. You want to read that book, and you know that nobody else is going to write it, so you have to write it yourself.
You've your books have sold about 55 million copies, which is a few. Does that make you feel a pressure when you write a new book, or does it make you feel no pressure at all?
I try to persuade myself into not feeling that pressure. I'm not sure, writing for me, you always have the option of not publishing the book. And I cling to that illusion that may not be published if it's not good enough. And actually, I have written 2 novels that I decided I will not publish. And in the end, I actually, pressed the delete button on those 2 novels. And that makes the pressure a bit less tense. But I think that the real pressure I feel is that when I wrote my first novel, I wrote it for 2 friends of mine. And we, shared taste in popular culture, music, movies, literature. And that's the same 2 guys I'm trying to impress now, 30 years later. And that's pressure.
Yeah, wow, it's nice to be able to focus it down like that. But look, I mean, I can see why your books sell as well as they do. Can you see why they sell as well as they do? Or is it a constant delight and surprise?
I try not to analyze it. I mean, I write for myself, or I don't write for myself, but I see it as inviting people to my home, where this is my world. I decide what we're going to eat, what music we're going to listen to, and so on. It's in some ways it's pure luck that what I find interesting and what I'm curious about, many other people seems to be curious about also. So I've seen so many brilliant writers that write books that are just beautiful, but they never get a mass audience. So it's not about quality. It's just, to some extent, it's about pure luck.
Well, it's very humble to say so. Look, I mentioned at the start that you played pro football as a young man before you had an injury that ended that, and you also you front a band, Didier, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Which at one point had the best-selling album in Norwegian history. Is there something about Norway that can allow you to do all these things, that you can be so prolific in so many fields?
I think that there's it's a small country, so you do get a chance to shine on the small stage of Norway. Probably easier to get that breakthrough or get that attention than in a bigger country or a bigger city with harder competition. That's true.
The New Yorker described you as your country's first international pop culture star. Do you feel like an ambassador for Norway at all?
Not at all.
Not at all.
No. I wouldn't want that responsibility, and I don't think Norwegians see me as that kind of personality. I'm not Bono from Dublin.
That's a good parallel, I think, maybe. Look, I read the introduction in your first book when you talk about when you'd the Bat, I think it is, when you talk about when you first came to write, when you took yourself to Sydney, you sat down to write, and the way you describe it, it's almost like you fall in love with this thing that you never knew that you'd be able to fall in love with doing. Is that still how it feels when you write? Are you still thrilled with every sentence?
I'm not thrilled with every sentence. I'm often very frustrated with many of the sentences. But I think that kick that I experienced when writing the first book, I sometimes get a taste of that again. But I guess it's a little bit like being a heroin addict, that you need bigger doses, and it's hard to find back to that initial rush that you had when trying the dope. But it's a joy. I mean, I still feel privileged when I have time to sit down and write, because I just love writing. I know that some writers, they find it a struggle, but I still find it a privilege.
Your books, they're all dark, right? And there's a bit of a trend, particularly in Britain at the moment, for sort of cozy crime writing, sort of Richard Osman type stuff. Do you ever feel the call of writing about a nice vicar in the countryside solving a tea party crime?
Not really.
Not really.
Not really. No, I like to. I'll stay on the dark side, I think.
What's your current project then? What's next for you?
Right now, I'm actually writing a movie script for the Nigh House. So we'll have to see how that turns out.
Oh, well, that could be very exciting. Look, a real pleasure to speak to you, Jo Nesbø. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.